this on? This is on. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're glad to have you here. So the format of our time today, we'll do about an hour or so interview, and then we'll do a question and answer time. So feel free to jot down the questions that come up along the way. And we'll start with some introductions.
Also, Gabby, just let everybody know if you want to share with your friends, it is going to be live streamed and it'll be on the YouTube channels.
Yes, it's live streaming, and we'll have it on YouTube. And I'll send it out on email. If you'd like to get on our newsletter list, make sure you get that. Just let us know, and we can keep sharing this out. Okay, so I'll start with myself. My name is Gabby Johnson, and I live in Grants Pass, and I've been here for about 12 years now. I'm a homeschooling mama and a community organizer and a close caretaker of Grants Pass Remembrance, which is the host for this event. And I wanted to give a big thank you to Trevor and the Hive for sharing this space with us. Thank you so much. And we also have some donations, some monies from a grant that have also made this possible. And who was that grant
Oregon
from?
Humanities.
Thank you, Oregon Humanities. So we're just so thankful for all the different spaces and ways in which our community and our greater community help make things like this possible. But yeah, tell us about yourself, Sarah.
Okay, my name is Sarah Sanderson, and I knew I was in the right place because my face was on all the TVs. So thank you for welcoming me to Grants Pass. I don't know if I've ever gotten off the freeway here before, so I'm really happy to be in the town. I think I saw somewhere a sign that said something about a warm welcome. You've definitely arranged a warm welcome. It's very warm out, so thank you for that. I'm the author of The Place We Make, and I'm sure I'll be sharing more about that as we go along, so I'll leave it there. Oh, I drove down this morning from the Portland area where I live with my husband and 4 children, but we are actually about to move to the East Coast at the end of this month, so only in Oregon for a few more weeks. Glad that I managed to squeeze this visit in. So,
As are we. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Taylor Stewart, and I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Remembrance Project. I help communities with truth and reconciliation projects around repairing historical injustice. I live in Portland, but I partner with communities across the state, Coos Bay, Grants Pass, Ashland, Eastern Oregon, doing this truth and reconciliation work, and I'm happy to be having this conversation with you all today.
Well, let's start with a brief introduction to the book in case you haven't read it yet. Now, there is a quote that you give on page 31 that says, "I wanted to understand who had made the place where I lived and how and why. I didn't begin with Oregon because it was worse than any other place. I began with Oregon simply because it was my place." And it is our place. So thank you so much for doing that personal work, because it is shared, it is ours too. And getting to walk with you through that journey of processing was a deep gift for myself, and I know I'm not alone in sharing that. So thank you, Sarah.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really wanted to highlight before we get too deep into how we do this is the spirit in which you did this. You talk about, on page 93, you talked about honoring those who came before me had to begin with being honest about them. And that theme comes up a lot, that honoring and honesty. And I wondered if you could talk just a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So, so the book really began when I moved back to Oregon. I was born in Oregon. I did some of my, I actually stopped by, on the way here, I stopped by the house that I lived in the year that the Challenger exploded. I lived in that house in Salem. That was a long time ago. And then I spent most of my life elsewhere until I returned as an adult 9 years ago to live in Oregon. And the genesis of the book really was my observation as an adult. Wow, this is a really white state, and why is that? And I had always sort of naively thought, well, I guess that's just who sort of ended up here. But then as an adult, kind of holding that observation and my curiosity around that, discovering some of our history as a state, that we are the only state to have joined the Union with an anti-Black exclusion law on our books. And so getting really curious about that, but then what kind of propelled this into a book was my realization that it was some of my own family members who had participated in upholding that early law. And I get into, in the book, I look at several different people around the story of Jacob Vanderpool, who was the only person ever known to have been exiled, legally exiled from the state of Oregon because of that law. And a couple people involved in that story, one was the person who pressed charges against him is a relative of mine on my father's side. And then also there was a leader in the community, a pastor and professor, who remained silent, and he was a relative of mine on my mother's side. So I have Oregon Trail ancestors that go way, way back, and when I realized that it was my own family who had, on the one hand, pushed to make Oregon a white-only state, and on the other hand, kind of stayed silent about that and not spoken out on behalf of Jacob Vanderpool, that's when I realized this isn't just some interesting story from the past, this is my story, and the book became my way to grapple with that. And so yeah, there was always this sort of like, how do I honor, as a Christian, I hold the commandment to honor your father and mother really seriously, right? But also, like, again, kind of bringing in my faith, looking at the Bible and the way that in the Bible, people are honored, yet their stories are told very honestly, right? Like when you read that book, there's a lot of bad stuff that people do, and they don't shy away from telling those stories. So I thought, okay, if the Bible itself can tell these stories about its own heroes, then I can tell these stories about my family members too.
I think one of the things that struck me in your own personal journey of realizing, oh gosh, this is personal to me, I'm related to these people, there was this process that I had of, gosh, this history is personal to all of us, but it's so easy to forget that our history is personal. And I think we all have this experience of, how do we talk about our history in a way that honors our ancestors and those that have come before us, and is honest about them? And that's hard.
Yeah, and I think it's something that we're not very good at as Americans. We've got the narrative of, they could do no wrong, the people who came over on the Mayflower, which I got an ancestor on the Mayflower too, and, wrote the Constitution, and, the story that's been told for all these hundreds of years is that these people were as near to perfect as we can imagine, right? And yet we live in this time where, as a society, we're starting to look and say, actually, no, there are some things that we should probably face up to. And it's hard, but on the other hand, I don't know, maybe this is weird, but I find it kind of exciting to be living in this time where we can say, hey, like, we get to start to get real here. And we get to be the generation that starts to tell the truth and figures out how to be honest about this. I think it's a wonderful time to be alive.
I'll add a quick thing about that because I'm working on a talk sort of about how we define the legacies of imperfect historical figures. And oftentimes when we talk about the sort of dichotomous relationship or the existence of a person, we often use the analogy of a coin, where one part of them is the heads, the other part is the tails. And we generally think about people in that binary fashion, but I think that one of the problems with that is it is impossible to see both the head side and the tail side at once. And in our culture right now, we've been doing a lot of flip-flopping between heads and tails, heads and tails, heads and tails. And so one analogy that I think would be more productive for us is to think about paint on a canvas, where if half the canvas was red and half the canvas was blue, you wouldn't say the painting is red, just as you wouldn't say it's blue. You would say it's both red and blue. And that, perhaps as time goes on and more of the painting fills out and it's more red than anything else, it's still not only red. There are still parts of blue, and in fact, some of the other colors that aren't blue actually make those blue pieces stand out more than if they had just been spread wider. And so I think that as we hold this yes and to our historical figures, it is more like looking at paint on a canvas, where that is a better way for us to understand the complexities of people. And, in doing this thought experiment about historical individuals, I've also felt that need to apply it to a larger system, like the United States of America as a whole. And that I have found a greater sense of home and belonging and understanding of this place we call home by learning to hold that yes and to the United States and the people within it. And I've been on this journey for about a year now, and I think that there really is, if we are willing to use both hands to hold both sides of these complexities, that there actually is a more fulfilling sense of wholeness on the other end.
I so agree. In our own story of our community's history as a Sundown Town, we talk a lot about broken and beautiful. Like it's both. We have beautiful history here, and we have broken history here. And how can we hold both of those? One of the things that I was really struck by in the personalness of our history in reading your book was also how you processed racism and your own personal process of working through that, and our story, not just in Oregon, but also it's on this backdrop of our whole country. And there's this piece in which, if we don't look at that, if we're not honest with it, then we remain disconnected. And so there's something about that piece of, there's so much beauty and joy and peace and shalom, you use that word quite a bit, that we get to experience if we connect. But it's hard. We have chosen for a long time to remain detached, but we're missing out on a lot of beauty in the process. Now, I kind of want to dive into some of that process that you shared about, starting with, you use the term turning as kind of as a way to talk about repentance, and I want to get into that more. But before we talk about the turning, I was really struck by how you noticed at some point you became aware and conscious of being continually surprised over racism. And I personally appreciated your articulation in your own process, because it's one that I, in so many different areas, recognize in myself, and it's one that I recognize in my neighbors, and it helped me process further in how I can have empathy and how I can partner along with my neighbors. But I wanted to talk for a minute about that continual surprise over racism. I have a friend who calls it incessant incredulity. So just this wait, no, that's not happening here. That didn't happen here. Really? Are you? And just that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think that, what I'm getting at there and what your friend is getting at is this sense that we sometimes have as white people every time we hear of some horrible racist thing that's happening, like right now in the world, just this jaw drop, like, oh, I can't believe someone would say that or do that. And it's like at a certain point, when we've had that response over and over and over and over and over again, it's like maybe we should start not being so surprised because this has happened before. But I think that sort of like jaw drop incredulity is actually kind of a self-defense mechanism, because we want to believe that we live in a perfect world and that all of us are perfectly kind and good and that racism is gone. And so every time it happens, then it's like all over again. Oh my goodness, what? That perfect world I imagined doesn't exist? But then we go right back to it until the next time, So it takes conscious effort, I think, as white people sometimes, to step out of that imaginary perfect world that we think we're living in and start to imagine, like, okay, what would it be like to not be so surprised about this?
It reminds me of honesty, that slow process of being honest with ourselves about what's happening and seeing it. Now, I wanted to read a quote before we get into this, because most of this time, this book holds so much history. It's worth the read just for all the history. But you also take us on a journey of your growth process and your engagement with that history. And there's something just really precious about that. And that's what I'd love to dig into during this time. And like I mentioned before, in the book, Sarah talks about repentance, and maybe you could talk for a second about breaking down that word and how you use it.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a loaded word, in today when we hear the word repentance, we might think about like hair shirts or self-flagellation or, fasting or I don't know, all kinds of like medieval tortures. But really the way I'm using the word is simply, turning from, a recognition that something isn't right and I want to turn away from it. And I think that it's to a sense of recognizing that we're always moving one direction or another. Like we might think that all the world's suffering and problems are over here and we're just kind of like hanging out, standing still right here. But I think it's a better way to express the truth of what's going on in the world is that we're all continually either moving towards love and joy and goodness or away from it. And so when we recognize that we're moving away from love and joy and goodness, how do we reorient ourselves and figure out how to move towards it once again? So that's kind of what I'm trying to get at with the book.
And you do. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and read this quote. She's talking about the different turnings that is happening. A turning from ignorance to empathy, a turning from clenched fist to open hands, a turning from supremacy to shalom, a turning from silence to self-disclosure, and a turning from the legacy of exclusion to a connection with others. Now, I'd like to get into each of these pieces. In this section, when you talk about a turning from ignorance to empathy, you talk about being able to begin to do that in your own public library. But the piece that I was so struck by was when you said, what I needed was not so much knowledge as empathy. I think in the work that I do in seeking to support other people in understanding the work that we do with Grants Pass Remembrance, so often I am depending on knowledge and information, and it just so struck me about, I really do think it's empathy that we need, and can you talk more about that?
Yeah, for me, it's about imagining my way in. I have not had the experience of moving around in this world with darker skin. I have not had the experience of hiding from a lynching mob. I have not had the experience of being enslaved. But can I imagine what it would be like to live those experiences? And I think if we go, it's that further step from just knowing that those things happened to imagining what it would be like to experiencing them, then that further step is going to pull us deeper into the story and help us to stay connected to the goal of wanting to repair some of these things.
A word that comes up a lot is proximity. We talk often about how one way that you can practice proximity is what you mentioned. You can access your public library. You can read books written by people that are sharing their own personal experiences of what it is like to live in this country with dark skin. And I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about what did that look like for you? What have you seen that look like for other people? That growing of empathy.
Yeah, well, it began, as you mentioned, just by reading, just by, it started with that curiosity, that observation I mentioned, like, oh, something's different about this state that I didn't notice when I lived here before as a kid. And then kind of wanting to know why, and then just kind of realizing that I had missed out on a perspective of history that was not taught to me. And then just wanting to know more and sort of spending a couple of years just saying, like, I just want to read these stories and kind of catch up on all the life that wasn't shared with me before when I came through, when I came through school. And then also it began to also look like, connecting with people that were kind of put in my path and asking more about their stories. But it began in the library.
It's a good place to go.
Yeah. I feel like in the last month, or even less than that, last few weeks, I've had my own experience having to practice empathy. We had a Juneteenth event a few months ago, or not months, when it was Juneteenth, June 19th. And it was a practice of empathy and a learning opportunity for myself, for something that Dr. Martin Luther King often talked about. Dr. King often talked about loving those who hated him, who persecuted him, who protested him. And admittedly, kind of in the back of my mind, I'm like, you're out of your damn mind. Like, what are you talking about? Like, they just, Bull Connor, like, really? And so I had this experience recently. We had some protesters at our Juneteenth event from a local group called the Salt Shakers, who you may or may not be aware of. And, it was an interesting experience for me to then have to practice empathy and compassion for the different roads that brought us all to that same space. What really sort of stood out to me was there was a, maybe middle school or high school age young girl with her mom, and, they're both in sort of ankle-length skirts. And what stuck out to me was a reminder of when people are stuck in some sort of ism, they're often victims themselves too. And so this isn't quite the right word that I want to use because it has different connotations, but sort of when you see people in a cult of some belief, thinking about it in that terms helped allow me to experience a level of not pity, but empathy and compassion that I am hoping we can begin to practice on a wider scale. Empathy for those who are different than us is rather sparse in our very polarized society. And so, it's a lot easier said than done. We're all barreling towards the most momentous elections in American history. How does keeping in the back of our mind empathy and compassion influence how these next few months of discourse should look like? And so, having had this experience to practice that recently, I'm trying to think now about how might I practice that in the lead up to November.
I want to mention in these discussions that we've got to have because of that, this articulation between pity and compassion has just really struck me. Pity is very much a looking down on. You're in a higher position, but compassion is this desiring to have an equal. That no, I'm going to treat you as an equal here, and there's something about that just really strikes me. And this word empathy. It's all about connection. It's seeking to connect with the other, not in a position of supremacy, whatever that supremacy be, whether it's religious supremacy or white supremacy or whatever it be, but as an equal and preserving the dignity of each person. Yeah, I'm just so thankful that you wrote this book, Sarah, because there's such deep pieces of that connection that I feel like it ties in that even the introduction into this process is about connection. Yeah. I wanted to get into kind of this next piece, your identification of the opposite of supremacy, not being shame, but being shalom. I'm going to read a couple quotes that she's written, then let you take it on from there. Shame had prevented me from truly seeing my sin. You talk about shame being a barrier, that we just keep kind of hiding it. And you share a quote by Maisha T. Hill, that says, "Shame can be a catalyst and a teacher, but only if we move through it, when we can fail our way forward to heal." Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah. Maybe this is just me being like armchair psychologist, but when I look out at the people in our society who are the loudest kind of about not wanting to have a discussion about the truth of what's happened in the past. For example, I'm thinking of a certain Florida legislator who's very proud of the fact that his state no longer teaches that slavery was bad, right? Not to name names. But anyway, when I look at those people, I wonder if what's going on there is shame. Not that they maybe can even articulate. I feel ashamed about our past. That's why I don't want to have students in my state learn about it. But I think as a society, as a country, we have a lot of collective shame. We know that these are terrible things that our country has done, and we don't know what to do about them. And because we don't know what to do about them, we think, well, we've got to just pretend that they didn't happen, or that we're over it, or that, there's no value in looking at it. Shame to me is that like stuck place of, let's not talk about this. But if we can move through that to a place of, I think about it very much positionally. Like supremacy means somebody's here and somebody's here. And so it can't be the goal that we just flip, and let's have the people on the bottom on the top and the people on the top on the bottom. Although, maybe that's what needs to happen. Maybe that's what we deserve as white people. But I don't think that's the goal. I think the goal is that we're like lowering the people that are on the top and raising the people that are on the bottom so that everybody is in a place of peace or shalom, kind of everything in its right place. And so that's where that came from for me, just thinking about, like, if I'm stuck in this place of, wrongly thinking that some people are better than others, what's the opposite? Where am I moving towards? It's not shame for having those feelings or for being raised in that society, but shame maybe can push us towards, let's figure out what kind of society we actually want to have, and how do we get there?
As I've been reflecting on shame myself, I've had some conversations with my kids, because shame is a very personal thing that happens all the time. This isn't just something that we deal with this particular history as white people. Like, this is shame is a personal experience that comes up often. And I've been struck by how rarely I use the term shame, and how I often don't correctly identify it, even in myself. Or as I was talking with them, it almost helped more to talk about what shame does than call it shame, and that hiding, that desire to hide something or to push it away. Which is a disconnection. It's that desire to not be honest, or to not tell everybody, or to not just tell that one person in front of you something that's going on because you feel shame around it. But I very rarely use that term shame. So it's interesting to think about how often, just in my own personal life, I don't use the term when I feel it. And I almost see it better when I tell myself, I'm wanting to hide this. I'm not wanting to look at this straight on. What's going on there? And I loved how this quote, the failing our way forward to heal, like that stumbling movement that like we will stumble. You know, it's a pretty common thing in conversations on racism to talk about how but I'm afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing, that kind of thing. Like, well, you might. That actually might happen, but that's okay. Like, let's fail our way forward to healing. Like, let's. Shame is not helping us. Shame is just such a barrier to any kind of healing.
Yeah, you know, feelings like shame, guilt, those are sort of stuck feelings. They're also human feelings, and often the things that we experience as individuals can also be extrapolated to how we feel things collectively. And, you know, whenever this sort of new information comes into our orbit, it forces us to have some sort of identity crisis. And for those of us who have lived in this world, we've all experienced some form of identity crisis, be it professional change, end of a relationship, new way that you see yourself. You know, oftentimes those are traumatic experiences, and we have to do that collectively in terms of learning about our community history, our state history, our national history. And so, given that connection between the personal and the collective, some of the strategies that we use for personal identity crisis can also be applied to collective identity. So before I started doing this work full-time, when I was in my master's program, I interned at an organization called Lines for Life. They're a suicide and substance abuse prevention organization. So if someone calls the National Suicide Hotline from an Oregon area code, it gets routed to Lines for Life. And one thing, so I was never on the phone lines for Lines for Life, but I still went through the training for those who were in the call center. And one thing from that training that I applied to this community organizing work is the idea that when you're on the phone with someone, you are helping them, quote, unpack their luggage, their feelings, their emotions. But what you can't do is end the call with their stuff all strewn about. Before you end the call, you have to help them repack their feelings, their emotions, their luggage before you can end the call. And so I take that same approach to community organizing, where if we're going to unpack this community history, we can't just have it laying about, because that's where a lot of the feelings of fear, resistance, and shame come from. We have to figure out how to repack that history into something new. For instance, with a lot of the work that we're doing around Sundown Towns, we are unpacking this history of racial exclusion, but then we're also repackaging it into this vision of a sunrise community. I play a game when I come to Grants Pass called Can I Get This Random Stranger to Support the Sunrise Project? I'll oftentimes be wearing a bright yellow t-shirt, and people be like, so what's that t-shirt about? And I'm like, let the games begin. People go through this process facially. When I say the word sundown, their face goes sad. But when 2 seconds later I say the word sunrise, their face goes happy, because they're like, oh, you gave me this thing and you gave me somewhere to put it. We're unpacking and repacking. And I think that element of repacking is extremely crucial to doing this work, because a lot of people don't know how to repack the suitcase. All they feel is their stuff strewn about. And so it's the job of folks like ourselves, folks here, to figure out how we can collectively repack community histories, state history, national history, because what we really are dealing with is an identity crisis.
And that honoring and honesty all the way through is hard but good and totally possible. I wanted to mention, you talked about how the reminder of God's love over you was an invitation to keep moving through the shame that you were feeling. And I see in our Sunrise Project work, I see how treating our neighbors with love and respect and dignity. Also, is that invitation to let's keep moving through. Like we're not bringing this up to make people feel bad, and like it's this. No, there's like we love Grants Pass. Like I know you two are not from Grants Pass, but thank you for. I feel the love anyway. But we love Grants Pass, and it's because of our love. It's because of our love for our neighbor that we want to get to talk about this and move through it, because there are some beautiful things that we can move into when we're connected and when we connect to this history. I wondered if you could talk just a bit more on that invitation to keep moving.
Well, I want to circle back to you mentioned fear, the concept of fear with shame. And I had a lot of fear about writing this book. I got very personal in these chapters, if you've read it, named a lot of my own stuff. And I was really afraid of, you kind of alluded to cancel culture without exactly using those words, but I was really afraid of getting canceled, that like, people over here would just be horrified, or people over here would be horrified for a different reason, and nobody was going to like me anymore, and it was going to be awful. And it was the my core conviction of my own belovedness, despite the fact that there's some stuff that I'm not proud of, that gave me the courage to keep moving through it, because ultimately I believe that the things that I feel ashamed of or that I'm trying to work through are not definitional to who I am. And I think that's true for all of us. We attach identities to ourselves that we feel bad about, but the stuff we feel bad about is not who we truly are. And so if we can figure out how to let that stuff go and be our own most beloved self, then we can move into a place of recognizing other people's most beloved self. I don't know if I answered your question. I forgot what you asked, but...
I love what you said, so
okay.
We're good to go.
That's where we went.
And that also actually leads us into the next section, this turning from silence to self-disclosure. And I want to kind of talk about that for a minute, because there was a process of that. As you started to talk with people, you started to realize that people didn't know how to talk about this, or they didn't want you to talk about it. They wanted silence. And in those, I don't know if any of you have had conversations with people that didn't feel like they went well, when you're wanting to talk about racism and they're not ready to talk about racism. And that process of you realizing, oh, I can share about myself and my own process of discovering the racism that I hold and carry and find coming up when I don't want it to be there, but it's still there. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah. So really the move towards self-disclosure was really about, it was about, I wanted to speak into a kind of a gap that I saw in our discourse around this. I saw a lot of people of color, especially coming out of the summer of 2020 after George Floyd was killed, but also, it's been going on for hundreds of years, right? Like we've been getting these reports of like, hey, this is how it feels, this is what's happening, I don't like this, this isn't right, this isn't just. And then I saw some white people saying like, yeah, those other white people need to stop doing that. And I didn't see a lot or anybody who was just saying like, yeah, you're right, and I'm sorry. And so that was kind of the space I wanted to step into, just to say like, yeah, you're right, and I'm sorry. So that's the book I wrote.
You did. I think that was actually what made it so powerful, is that it was personal. And it's so, I feel like I said this earlier, but it's so easy for us to depersonalize our history, and it's ours today. It's not just my ancestors yesterday. It's not the only reason why we're here. It's been passed on, and I still carry that, and I still confront that. And what does that look like? And to share vulnerably is hard. It's scary. We don't know what that's going to look like. But to enter into conversations and to be able to say I think it seems to be really easy for us to say you over there. And there's something beautiful about that that I have enjoyed the process of internalizing again, and what could that look like for me, and how can I say I even more, and how could I share my story, and what parts of my story am I afraid to share? Like, oh, yeah, that would be hard to share out loud. Oh my gosh, Sarah, how did you do that? Like, when you said those things, I was just like, so she shares in her book about just discovering the moments of her own of racism and supremacy and how they're happening in her real-time life. And it felt very normal for me to read them. It wasn't until later on that I was like, oh my gosh, that must have been a scary process to share that out loud. Because when I think of the stories for myself, I think, oh yeah, I don't tend to share that out loud, and you wrote it in a book. But it's a great gift to be vulnerable. And that risk of vulnerability invites, your book is invitational for us to do the same. And there's something really beautiful about that. I wanted to mention some things on silence. You say, staying silent about white supremacy is like putting a bandage on a deep wound. Maybe for a while you can forget about it, but sooner or later it stinks. I've often referred to racism as a wound that we're not caring for, but I never thought about how, it's a wound we've covered and we're not caring for. That's like a whole nother layer. Can you share the story about your son?
Yeah, so that analogy comes from my son was, I forget, he was around 10. And he fell while he was at my mom's house and just got a gash in his shin. And she put a big bandage on it, one of those big Band-Aids that covers like the whole thing and it like sticks on every side. And he put his pants on and forgot about it. And I don't even know if I was there. I'm sure I was not there when that happened. And so he goes about his life, and it's winter, and he's wearing pants, and he's like, too old for me to be like helping him in the bathtub anymore. And so I'm completely unaware of the fact that he left that bandage on his leg for like 3 weeks. And one day we're sitting around watching TV, and my husband goes, what stinks? And we quickly trace the source of the odor to my son's leg, which has begun to become gangrenous. And I brought him to the pediatrician the next day, and the pediatrician said, it's a good thing you didn't wait any longer on this one. I mean, he could have, not only does it stink, he could have lost his leg because he just had this piece of plastic over this wound for a month. And so, yeah, that was just the idea that, when we cover something and don't allow it to heal properly, it can become more destructive than it even was before.
There's something, so this new layer of the analogy that I will be using now about covering, it's a covered wound, because the astounding piece is that if we uncover it, if we're honest, that actually starts the process in so many ways.
Yeah, one thing that I'll add a little bit to the wound analogy is sometimes someone who has been wounded extremely doesn't realize they've been wounded until someone points it out. And you're like, oh, hey, you're actually really bleeding from your arm. And then they're like, I didn't realize that. And they're like, well, now that you pointed that out, now it hurts. And I think that that's a little bit some of what we do in terms of our history of racism in America. And you're like, someone points it out, and you're like, okay, well, now I hurt. And there's almost like, well, I wish you didn't point out that I was bleeding. But if we refer to the medical analogy, you're like, okay, well, it's a good thing you pointed that out so that it can move towards healing. The correct answer isn't, okay, I see that, bandage, we're good, but that there is that element of like, we need that treatment. But I think that it's important for us to be aware that sometimes before even that treatment is just the awareness of the injury itself.
Yeah.
I will just add real quick, too, that I shared this story with a group of people over Zoom who are in Pasadena, and there was a black doctor in the crowd, and afterwards he stood up and he shared, and I'm not going to remember all the things he said, but he said, if it had gotten into the bloodstream, it would have been systemic. And if it had affected the bones, it would have been structural. And he had like all these different analogies to like different parts of the body and what racism does to like all these different parts of our society. And I have it written down somewhere, but I've got that doctor in Pasadena to thank for that.
Yeah. I'm so glad for doctors. And the way in which we are a body. We function like this is, like, we affect each other. We are connected. Your actions affect me, and vice versa. And it can be so easy for us to want to just separate, to leave behind different groups of people that it feels like it will be too hard to figure out how to deal with, which is where supremacy, I think, comes from. I can't figure out a way to do it, and so we'll just not include you. But we are connected, and so that piece of how can we keep nurturing that connection and looking at it, even if we don't know the way forward yet. I did want to mention, I really appreciated you talking about how the opposite of silence is not just any kind of speech, and that's very meaningful. I think there have been seasons of my life where I just wanted to speak, and so sometimes it was in anger, and sometimes it was in bitterness and impatience. But that's not the kind of speaking that actually leads us forward to connection. This self-disclosure, this the way that you articulated that, I think, is just really meaningful. How can we each personalize this? And where is our place in it? And how can we give our neighbor the gift of my I statements and my process, even while you're in the process of trying to figure out what yours is, or not being aware that there's a personal process there. Yeah.
Yeah, in terms of the one thing that I like to say is reconciliation requires specificity. And so, in terms of we understand it interpersonally, you're like, oh, you stole from me. And you're like, oh, well, let me polish your car. Or you're like, that's not really the thing that I want back. That's not specific to the harm. And so in terms of racial exclusivity, the opposite of that is this sort of specificity of welcome. And, this is a little bit of a roundabout answer that I don't actually have an answer for. But so, I come down to Southern Oregon once a month, once every other month. And, I'm very proud that I don't need Google Maps when I go around town. I just know where the things are. I can get to Fred Meyer and Walmart and all those things. And so once someone asked me, do you feel comfortable in our community as a person of color? And I answered yes. But as I had left the interaction, I felt like there was this yes, but I couldn't figure out what that but was. And I thought about it more. I was like, okay, I think that but I feel like I have to be my perfect self in spaces. I have to be extra friendly, extra cordial, and not that those aren't elements of myself, but you just feel like you have to be sort of in that perfect mold. And I was still kind of searching for a way to describe it. I just got back from Florida from visiting my wife's family, and we had a good trip, but that experience helped articulate for me that feeling that I was feeling where there's this comfortability, but you feel like you have to be perfect. And I was like, That's like being with your in-laws, where you're like, yes, I'm comfortable, we're family. You know, I've only been married for a year. We just celebrated our 1-year anniversary. And you're like, I'm comfortable with you, but I still feel like I have to be the best Taylor when I'm with you. And so that I've realized that is the feeling that is shared by a lot of people of color, of that I'm comfortable, but I have to be my best self. And so, I actually don't know what the antidote is to that feeling. I haven't been married long enough to know when that sort of feeling, whether that feeling goes away with your in-laws or not. And I'm sure there are some people out here with much more marriage wisdom than I do that may have some wisdom about how do you make that, what made you feel that fully comfortable in your family setting, I think can hopefully be applied to that comfortability that we want people of color to feel, which is the sort of specific antidote to racial exclusion in a community.
I'm going to be pondering that one, Taylor, because there's something there. And that also leads us into the way you interacted with the word reparations really struck me. Reparations is a term that is a very scary term in this conversation. It can be a huge barrier for people to engaging in the conversation. I have seen it to be one that kind of kills curiosity. And I wondered if you could talk about that a bit and the way in which you made that personal link to reparations in the process of writing your book.
Well, I think the reason it kills curiosity is that money is the thing that's most important to us in our society. And it's the one thing that we just can't let go of. And so as a practice, just apart from even the conversation of race, I think it's a valuable practice for all of us to just practice giving our money away. Just because that's when we learn whether it's the most important thing to us or not. And as part of that practice, as we think about where do we want to give our money and how and why, I do think that there is an element of personal reparations that we can make. For me, as a person who is descended from enslavers on both sides of my family, I mean, my father's 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 father enslaved human beings. And I can look down the family tree, and it's not that anybody has ever said to me, like, here's your slave money check, because they haven't. But, what did that money buy socioeconomically, in terms of like position in society and education and housing and stability and nutrition and like all of these things that have been given to me and my family over generations. And it was stolen. It was stolen from other people. And so, like as Taylor said, there's a specific kind of repair that needs to happen, and it's economic. And so for me as a person, what does it look like on a personal level to say, all right, I've got, X number of dollars in my bank account that may not be very many on any given day, but what can I do with these dollars? And there are some things I have to do. I have to take care of my children. It won't help anybody if my kids are, sleeping on the street. But once I've taken care of the things I need to take care of, then what do I do with the rest of my money? And so there's that personal element to it. But there's also a national element to it. Because this was a national scale problem that was sanctioned by our whole country at every level of government, and it was theft. And the value of the amount of dollars that were stolen, just if you just count, like, okay, if you're gonna, so there's a book called The Black Reparations Project. It's very wonky, like you kind of have to be like an economics PhD to understand it. But there's a table in that book where they just tabulate what was the average minimum wage in this given year, and how many enslaved people were there, and how many hours did they work, And what's the amount of wages that were stolen? And then compound the interest on the delayed payment. And this table covers pages, and it's just numbers, right? Aside from the titles at the top, it's just numbers. And the first column, dollars per hour, is like 2. You know, it was minimum wage was $2 an hour in 1776, and it was $2.15 in 1777, or whatever it was. But then the other numbers are just enormous, and they grow and they grow and they grow. And there's something about looking at this page filled with numbers and realizing this is actual hours that actual human beings worked without pay. It's a debt. And debts don't just go away because the people who they were owed to have died, right? Like, if your parents stole a car and then left it to you in their will, that doesn't mean you get to keep it, right? If the police came to you and said, like, that car isn't yours, you'd say, well, my parents left it to me and now they're dead. And it's like, well, it still belongs to someone else, right? And so, yes, it is scary to think about, but as a society, we owe a debt. And until we figure out how to repay it, it's only going to grow.
I was sitting here thinking about something new based on something you had said about like comfortability giving our money away. And I sort of had me thinking a little bit about the like Christian practice of tithing, where there's the logistical, like, help make sure your church can function and then you're funding the church. But there's also that sort of, with the original call, the element of like, that money doesn't belong to you. Part of you not being so stuck with it is that practice of giving. And, I don't know if there is room for tying into the Christian tithing practice, that sort of releasing, I grew up in the church, and a lot of it is, well, this is God's money and I'm giving part of it back to him. If you took that same approach, you're like, well, this is God's money and I'm giving it back to him via these ways that we're rethinking social society that is semi-adjacent to some Christian principles. That's certainly something I'll be thinking about a little bit more in the near future.
I gotta admit, hearing this, I feel in me this like tightening of, oh my gosh, how on earth, like it can be overwhelming. And I think that that's hard to sit with. That's hard to sit in and stay in. It's hard to be honest about and not know the way forward, and to wait in and to maintain curiosity. It can feel that the debt, the burden, just feels heavy. One of the things I appreciated about, you used the term reparations in a moment when you were doing research, and you realized that there was a document down in Salem that was only in Salem, and Eugene, somewhere, thank you, that was not where you lived, and there was some way that you could have gotten it, but you decided, you know what, maybe this is a way that I can make a personal step of reparations. I'm going to take my body down to this place, and I'm going to do that work, and I'm going to pay that money, and I'm going to find that. And there was something about that helps keep me in when it feels hard to have those conversations of that was connected and grounded in your life and in what you were doing. And I wonder if there are more ways than we realize that are actually connected to us, that if we just had that eyesight, we might see it.
Yeah, and I think this also gets at the other thing that white people often say, which is, well, what should I do? What do you want me to do? What should I do about this? And there's no one-size-fits-all answer to that question, right? And we have such a complex society, and we each occupy a very individual place in that society. And so what I'm supposed to do is different from what you're supposed to do and what you're supposed to do and what each of you are supposed to do. But if we can stay open to, well, I have a desire to do something. What is it? What's my next step? And so, yeah, reparations is a little bit like that. Like there's the big picture, like it will take congressional committees, decades to figure out. But then, yes, there's also just the individual, like, what can I do to repair? And holding on to, and Taylor is good at emphasizing this, that the verb of reparations is simply repair. What's the step that I can take to repair some of this?
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to mention this little last piece that you talk about, this last turning or movement. And that's the one that you share about when you realize that all the others you could do alone, which I love. I love that there are so many things that we can just do on our own. I think we forget that I in this process. But it was when you realized that when you were going to be turning from our legacy of exclusion, you couldn't do the opposite of that on your own. You needed to connect with others. You needed to be in community. And you used the term the building of the beloved community, which is one that we cherish in our work for the Sunrise community. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
It was very much this realization that, I have lived in mostly white neighborhoods. I've gone to mostly white churches. I've gone to mostly white schools. I just had a really mostly white social bubble. And I think that there's a reason why, it's sort of a trope of like what not to say as a white person is like, well, my black friend said, But the reason that we want to jump to like my black friend is because honestly, like most of us don't have black friends. And so if we do, or if we have somebody we think maybe is a friend, it's like, aren't you proud of me? Like, there's someone that could maybe be my friend. But just to sit with like, okay, where I am right now is a mostly white bubble. And that's, some of that is because of my own life choices, and some of it is because the way our society has been structured for hundreds of years. And that's just where we're living now. And then for me, it was like, okay, if I want to figure out how to make connections beyond this mostly white bubble, how do I figure that out? And then I got an email from Taylor, and I was like, oh, there's Taylor. But yeah, it's been a growing process of making connections and building communities.
Yeah, in terms of, we live in the communities that we live in. We can't change Oregon's racial demographics overnight. That's unrealistic, but maybe on a multiple decade plan we can. One thing that I've been thinking about recently that is in line with Sarah's book about Jacob Vanderpool is what, Jacob Vanderpool was expelled from Oregon City. What would it look like for Oregon City to sort of, quote, do the opposite of that? And so I have been thinking about what sort of physical installations in the community could act as sort of a cultural anchor or a cultural magnet that both tethers people of color, specifically African Americans, to the community, as well as draw them in. And I had a conversation a number of months ago with someone at a conference. They're from Boston, and they were telling me about their community. They're Asian, and they described their neighborhood in terms of two terms: pre-Asian grocery market and post-Asian grocery market, where once the Asian grocery market was installed, it actually increased the Asian population of the surrounding communities because they saw that both this is a place for me, as well as they're a way for me to meet my needs. And so I've been thinking about that same idea. How do we create that same phenomenon in Oregon? What can we physically install that can be that cultural anchor as well as cultural magnet? And so Sarah will be leaving Oregon City here in the near while, but we'll be continuing this memorialization of Jacob Vanderpool. I'm really hoping to create in Oregon City a African American specific community center called the Vanderpool House. A lot of what we've done talking about Jacob Vanderpool is this big question about what if he had never been expelled from Oregon? What could his business have been in the Oregon City community for decades to come? And so this is our sort of new best way to try and replicate both what could have been, as well as how do we create that welcoming space in a community that had that history of exclusion. Can we have that same Asian grocery store phenomenon where one day, multiple decades from now, the racial demographics of Oregon City look differently because of this physical installation that both tethered and drew people into the community? And so I think that it's just, it just involves creative solutions. What can we install in our community physically that is welcoming to people of diverse backgrounds? And that may, it doesn't mean we're going to install an identity-specific community center in every community across the state of Oregon. But what physical things in a community can we point to that say that's a cultural anchor, that's a cultural magnet? And I think that idea is hopefully how we end up with a more diverse Oregon 100 years from now.
In a lot of ways, that's why we have Juneteenth, is for those of us that are here, and to say to those that aren't here, hey, there is a place for you here too. And these cultural magnets, and these are all acts of repair. But often, when they're so connected, you driving down to be physically present to get that information in Salem, we don't see them as acts of repair. They just fit. They make sense. And I think that's the hope that I hang on to when I see something that I'm like, whoa, I don't know how something's gonna fit and make sense. But I can sit in it and wait because I see all these other little pieces that like, oh no, this is good. This is connected. This is all about connection. I want to open up our time right now to a Q&A time. What kind of questions do you have for Sarah or Taylor? Yeah. I can bring the microphone to you if you've got something.
Yeah, why was Vanderpool the only person to meet that legal challenge? There must have been more black people than one in the state.
So that is a really great question. I'm glad you asked it. And the answer is there were some other people who were convicted of breaking the law. And in their cases, it was their white community, their friends and neighbors, who stepped in and said, we don't want this person to be exiled. And that actually made the difference and saved them from actually physically having to leave the state. So in Vanderpool's case, it was the failure of the white people around him to step in that caused him to have to leave.
Thank you. I'm from London originally. Jean, my wife, was born 26 miles from me in London, although we met in Mexico. I have a very different perspective on things. I think shame covers the world's population. I see so many things going wrong in the world. And I'm not sure that this discussion is big enough. I'm sorry, I don't mean to critique it, but I think. And what I want to know is, what can the younger people, such as yourselves, I'm going to be 80 in November, what can the younger people do to resolve the situation with the world's going wrong? Thank you.
Yeah, there is an idea that I say frequently is don't let your inability to do everything stop you from doing one thing. I also another sort of idiom that I hold to is success is a function of realistic expectations. And so I have dreams of making an impact in, I'm mostly just focused on Oregon. I grew up here. This is where I call home. This is the place where I'll do this work. But I do somewhat hope it affects issues nationally. Particularly, I do a lot of work around trying to end the death penalty, both here in Oregon and across the United States. And so, Oregon has the death penalty. No one's on death row. There's a moratorium. One of the questions is what's the urgency to end the death penalty in Oregon? My answer being, we can't really, us here in Oregon can't be involved in ending the death penalty in, say, Mississippi, if we still have the death penalty ourselves. And so, for me, I'm an Oregon guy. I've never lived anywhere else. I've only ever lived a half hour from the hospital I was born at. And so this is this is the place where I want to do this work that I hope can be an example. What we're doing around Sundown Towns here in Grants Pass has not really ever been done anywhere else in the United States. And so what we do here can hopefully be an example for the state as a whole, which can hopefully be an example for communities across the country. And so maybe it's my personality. People are like, you should run for president. And I'm like, absolutely not. That is not my scope of focus. I'm a small pond kind of guy. And so, I hope that what we do in these small spaces can make that worldwide impact. I think about, people from all across the world visit the cities in Alabama that were related to the civil rights movement. Civil rights trips are a multi-million-dollar industry. And so my hope, and so then that civil rights movement that occurred in the American South has been able to be an example for justice seekers across the world. And so I guess my long-winded answer would be, let's create that thing in Oregon that people from across the world want to come visit. I want there to be a racial justice tour in Oregon so that folks don't have to go all the way across the country to have that same experience. I started my work in Coos Bay and then here in Grants Pass in Ashland. I want people to travel across the state to learn and be inspired by communities who've been able to overcome some form of injustice. And so I guess my long-winded answer for how I would approach that is, can we create something here that can be inspirational for people across the world?
Yeah, I would just want to affirm everything Taylor just said. Part of the reason why I called the book The Place We Make is because I really believe that we are all, every day, with everything we do, involved in making the places where we live. And so, all change starts locally. But you're right, of course. The story of white supremacy is a global story, and it's 400 years, and it's all over the world. I actually just got back on Thursday from Rwanda. I was in Zambia and Rwanda, and the reason that I went there, I was invited to speak at a conference, and the talk that I gave was about kind of public lament and repentance for the sins of colonialism. And it was interesting, the conversation, even just talking about what I was doing there, opened interesting conversations. I met a woman, a British woman who had lived in Zambia for 50 years, a white woman, and I said, this is why I'm here, and her face just fell, and she said, well, the colonists were here to spread the gospel. And I'm like, well, maybe some of them, but there were also a lot of other motives going on, right? And then I talked, just 10 minutes later, I talked to a Zambian doctor, and he said, I've never met a white person who is willing to talk about this history. And so, wherever in the globe we are, whether it's Zambia or Rwanda or Grants Pass, like the call is the same. The call is to get honest about the history and figure out what specific local steps can we take right here to begin to repair that.
I want to share about part of my entry into this work was watching other countries do work. So South Africa and their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, reading a bit up on Germany and how they dealt with their history in the aftermath. Brian Stevenson, who's doing work out, is he in Alabama?
Montgomery, Alabama.
Okay, thank you. And seeing these people that are doing solid work of hope and love and compassion, and getting to enter into the story and join them in it in all of these far off places and connect those dots. There is deep hurt and wounding, and we are still wounded and still wounding. And there are healers that have been on the scene. I'm thinking of Mr. Rogers. He says, anytime in a crisis, find the helpers. There have been helpers on the scene throughout, and they're on the scene today. Even just this, reading your book was such a gift to me. I had no idea you existed. These last many years, you were deep in your own process, as I was deep in my process, as I've gotten to partner with people locally in Grants Pass that are seeking to engage in their process. There's such hope in the midst of the deep hurt that it's not that it's not, but and there is hope.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that have come up?
I'll just sort of tag on and maybe end us with this. I'm sure our friends from England have noticed Americans like to be number one at things. We are world champions for domestically played sports. And so whether for good or not, there's this American exceptionalism that is a part of our culture. And so I'm like, let's play into that. Let's become the number one country in the whole world for historical reconciliation. We look to Germany, we look to South Africa. As Americans, let's be number one. And so we can start that locally. All right, Oregon, we're gonna be the leader. We're gonna be number one in the United States. And by sort of, playing into that element of who we are, we like that number one status. And so I definitely think that I believe that we can do it. And I think that it's that belief, I call it unrelenting hope. That unrelenting hope in folks like yourself who came out in the middle of 107. I was a little bit nervous because I was like, I don't know if I would leave my air conditioning to come here and I'm supposed to speak. So I think that that's sort of the last idea that I want to leave us with is that you all being here today is what feeds that unrelenting hope. Your willingness to be a part of this conversation on your Sunday in the middle of a heat wave, I think is testament to the folks in this community who can make Grants Pass and Oregon and the United States a leader for this kind of work.
Thank you for joining us today. Feel free to hang out and chat for a bit if you want to get to connect with Sarah. She's got her books for sale right over here, and she will even sign it for you. And if you brought your own book, she'll also sign it for you, too. She's gracious like that. So, yeah, thank you.